up the dough. Isn't that correct? And it's not. I don't know if that's sinister or not. I mean, there seems nothing covert about it in any case, nothing surreptitious. I saw a very interesting discussion involving my friend Robert Fisk, who's one of the best of the Middle Eastern reporters, if not the best, and some other participants. I think this was actually on the BBC World channel, which isn't bad. And what Fisk said, this was at a time when there was talk of, not letting Al Jazeera broadcast just straight to us with Mr. bin Laden's remarks. Fisk said, well, the thing is this, Fisk has met bin Laden more than anyone else, I believe. So when he meets bin Laden, he asks him a lot of questions. He doesn't just say, have you got any remarks I can carry away with me and put in my newspaper so that your words get to the rest of the world. He's not a megaphone. He's not a ventriloquist dummy. And Jazeera does do that, or has been doing that. Whereas when they interview Tony Blair, say, or anyone else, they quite rightly ask him a lot of tough questions. So what they need to do is become a great deal more journalistic and combative, and they have to do the job of asking questions. They can't just be a megaphone.
Next call, Philadelphia, for Christopher Hitchens. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My question is, the attack on the World Trade Center, in many ways, was another Pearl Harbor. It was a sneak attack. There had been many indications before than actual actions over the intervening 30 years where Americans have been attacked generally overseas. My question is, do you reckon that it will always be a Pearl Harbor type of action, World Trade Center kind of action that is required in future to rouse this country to really address issues? Is this the nature of democracies?
Thanks, caller. And if I could pick up as a segue to what you write in Vanity Fair, which is, more than I worry about flag waving, I worry about what will happen when the flag waving has to stop. All these ceremonies of emotion, from children's drawings to fund drives, are prone to diminishing returns. A time will come when fewer taxis fly the Stars and Stripes, and it could be just at that point that another awful wound is inflicted by covert and nefarious enemies.
Yeah, I do worry about that. I also say in that piece that I think Pearl Harbor is the least useful comparison. I'm sorry to disagree with you, sir. Pearl Harbor was something that could have been and was predicted, not the day or the timing, but it was understood that the United States and Japan were maneuvering for an advantage in the Pacific where the empires were going to clash, and probably the first clash would be naval. The Japanese found a brilliant way of finessing that, at least to their opening advantage, and they used their own uniformed flyers, losing many of them in the process, to attack a strictly military base. Now, it's very underhand, admittedly, but it was within the rules of imperial and imperialistic warfare, by no means the worst thing that's ever been done. By contrast, the forces of Al-Qaeda use civilians as missiles to kill civilians. And if they had succeeded in what they might have had in mind, I believe they could have had in mind in New York, which all you have to imagine is that those planes went sharking into the buildings only perhaps half an hour later, which is, given what takeoff times are like at Logan Airport in New Jersey, as anyone who's tried it knows, wouldn't have been at all unthinkable. You could have factored that in. The buildings could have been nearly full. That's 50,000 people, as far as the attackers know. And they might have aimed and hoped to bring them down, not to implode them, but to bring them down sideways, make them fall over, which if they fall, they're both a quarter of a mile high. They could have hoped to kill 100,000 people in Manhattan at rush hour, or early morning. That would have been the Dresden of the Taliban. It would not have been a Pearl Harbor at all.
We're going to go back to calls, but very quickly. And this photograph is when the Twin Towers were completed, and as you write, you first saw them back in the summer of 1970 when the World Trade Center was still under construction. Do you think they will, or should they rebuild the World Trade Center?
I would say that I'm one of those who thinks it would be a bad idea. For one thing, I don't think it's possible to build on that site. I'm not a religious person. I don't believe particularly in the sacrosanctness of remains. I'm going to give my own carcass to science. I've already done so, in fact. But I think everyone has a natural revulsion against desecration. And this is like Antigone. This is the unburied bodies more or less in the streets. I don't think you can build on that.
Next call from London for Christopher Hitchens.
Thanks for taking my call, Mr. Hitchens. I like your comments, especially your view and opinion on India's position in the world, in the global economy today and in the global political scenario, especially your comment about secular, pluralistic, and democratic approach of India. As I compare the status of Pakistan pre-September 11th and now, I would like your opinion, especially when Pakistan used to be a vehement supporter of the Taliban and had diplomatic relations with the Taliban, was state-sponsoring terrorism. In fact, also calling General Pervez Musharraf, the military dictator, calling some of the terrorists who've been banned by the Western world freedom fighters. And now, in the last 2 months, as you compare the status of Pakistan, where now they are being showered with military aid, 28 F-16s just been reallocated to Pakistan, $1 billion aid package, while some of the fundamentals still stay the same.
I very much agree with you, and I've in my forthcoming piece in Vanity Fair, I rehearsed a lot of the same misgivings that I have about current U.S. policy. I think it's far too indulgent to the Pakistani military oligarchy, which is the problem in the first place. Mr. Bush, in his opening speech, said, "We will make no distinction, if you remember, between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and those who harbour them." Well, this is more the Pakistani military oligarchy and the Saudi Arabian ruling family have done much more than harbour Al-Qaeda. The Taliban, they have sponsored, incubated, and paid for, armed, helped, and trained them, and installed them, riveted them upon the luckless people of Afghanistan, who, in a history of having had some very depressing governments, have never had anything as horrifying as this. Slavery, penury, beggary, destitution. That's what they've done to the Afghan people. Think what they would do to us. So, I thought that, I thought and think that the dependence of the United States policy on not really owning up to that, because we'd rather say we had Muslim friends than say what ought to be said about General Musharraf and the Saudis.
In addition to
we become prisoners of our allies, and the fact of the matter is the Pakistani army is sabotaging the war against the Taliban. It doesn't want it to succeed. It openly says it doesn't want it to succeed, if you read what it says carefully. It wants to keep as much of its Afghan assets as it can. It wants to hold on to a pliable quasi-Taliban regime, I think, in Kabul, in order that it retains strategic depth, as it calls it, for a confrontation with India, a holy war confrontation, as they call it, over Kashmir, into which they have introduced nuclear weapons. This is an unbelievably appalling ally to have. And as I say, I have the strongest doubt that it is anything more than a very false friend in this battle.
And I'm sorry to mean to interrupt you. I was going to plug the book again and also mention that our guest also writes for Vanity Fair and The Nation magazine, and we have hyperlinked The Nation as part of C-SPAN's website if you want to log on and find out more about that publication. We'll get a call from Jensen Beach, Florida. Good morning.
And you were going to waive the book then?
And we'll waive the book again. We're not doing it enough?
Well, that was very, no, just you said you were about to. So
this is it.
I didn't want to step on that line, promise you.
Go ahead, caller.
Oh, am I on?
You are.
Sure.
Thank you, C-SPAN. Mr. Hitchens, Brian Lamb's not there this morning, so I have to ask you, are you still a socialist?
I think I say this in the book. 20 years I've been doing the show, very nearly 20 years, more or less since it started. And Brian always used to ask me with this look of polite incredulity, you know, you said you were a socialist, wow, you know, and then it became a habit. Every time I came back on, he'd say, well, by the way, I haven't checked lately, are you still? And every time I'd say, sure, I would never be pushed off position of principle like that, and I knew that one day he thought, I'll ask him and he'll say, no, I've rethought it. And then I started to think, I'm not going to give him the satisfaction. So it's probable, here we come to it, it's probable that I went on saying I was for slightly longer than I would have done if it wasn't for Brian Lamb. Or that maybe the Brian Lamb kept me a socialist longer. I actually now, for various reasons I haven't got time for, I don't have a political allegiance any longer. I don't have an ideological one either. I spent my entire life on the Marxist left, and I learned a lot from it, and if I could tell you, so quite a lot about this is in the book, about what I learned and what I thought was worthwhile from it, and would still defend. But I now don't really think there is a socialist movement I don't think it's going to revive.